Okay, good morning, everybody. We are happy to have those of you who can join the call, and for those of you who are watching, today we have Roxanne Evans with us from Brain Balance, and we really wanted to bring more content onto our network with mental health because there are so many things challenging our kids today, and also wanted to just give Roxanne an audience about some of the great work that people may not know about that happens at Brain Balance and how they can actually be supporting schools. So with that, Roxanne, I'll open it to you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to share some tools with you all and to be able to share what we can bring and offer as far as some professional development and things, just to help teachers have another tool in their toolbox. We know that a lot of great educators out there doing amazing things for students. There is a lot of new research in the last 20 years that really hasn't filtered down to the field in the amount of quantity that we wanted it to, because so much of what we're seeing with kids, especially with COVID, the lack of regulation. And I think that everybody knows that they've got multiple kids in every classroom that have difficulty regulating their emotions, regulating their attention. And so we really do have a lot of things to offer as far as for kids to help build that, but also to help the teachers have a new lens to look through. And that's really the foundation of what I like to share with teachers and schools when I go out is what lens are we looking at these kids through? And I brought a little visual for everybody since I was a teacher, third grade, fourth grade teacher. So I have some lenses, right? There's some red, here's some blue, here's a yellow, here's the purple. So we have a lot of visual stimulation that we use for building some kids' auditory and sensory processing, visual processing, different things like that. But what we look through is a lens of function first. And one of the things that I think most teachers have a really good handle on is what is typical for their age that they teach, right? So when I taught third graders, we had a pretty good understanding of what third graders were capable of producing for us, what they were capable of producing at the beginning of the year, toward the middle, and then at the end of the year, what we hoped or expected to have as an outcome. What we really see with students that struggle is that what they bring to the table isn't necessarily typical. And so we always say, look through the lens of function first, development second, and then maturity last. So maturity actually encompasses not only behavior, but learning styles. So going back to function though, I want to just kind of give a little basic breakdown of function. We've all seen the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Certain things have to be set for students to be able to be capable of learning in an environment, right? They have to feel safe. They have to have all their needs met physically, and then they're capable of applying attention. What we see in the research is that those first 3 years of life, there are some base functions of operating systems that the brain needs to develop in order to be ready to learn or ready to develop. And so what that base function looks like is their brain stem being completely taken into effect for maturity, making sure that their primitive reflexes are integrated and they can override their emotional response to the logic center and the reason center. So by 3 years old, we see kids more able to reason through why they can't do something, why they have to put the toys down, why they need to come back to things later. They handle frustration much easier by the time those things are in place. Then as we start looking at how the brain filters information, birth to 3, they're building a major filter in their brain. They are taking in tons and tons of information in the environment. So they're taking in visual, auditory, proprioceptive input. Just the amount of information that they're getting is so overwhelming, but the brain has to figure out how to take it in, tune out what we need to tune out, and then tune into what we need to tune into. And that's just a basic modulation and regulation of the brain. We're very familiar with regulation of emotions. We tell the brainstem to pause, let me think through this first, and then respond. The kids that are struggling with function, one, don't process that sensory information appropriately, And we refer to it as a churn, because just like churning water, that information keeps bombarding them and they don't have the tools to tune it out. So then we have lots and lots of information that is creating this cognitive load that is just so wide and it's being used up, right? So when we see these kids, we know that they're already battling, already dealing with things consciously that they should have in their autonomic function, which means they shouldn't have to think about those things. So base function is impacting their cognitive load already. So when we see kids come into our classrooms and we say, well, we know what's typical for a second grader or a fifth grader, and we are seeing students that can't produce what's typical, there are a lot of reasons for that. But I want us to change the lens that we view these children through. And instead of saying, you know, this kiddo is manipulative, this kiddo is defiant, this kiddo is lazy, this kiddo just doesn't care, this kiddo has major separation anxiety, right? You know, there are so many things that we kind of say about kids, and that's the lens that we view them through. I like to say, look at function first. What are they capable of producing for us individually? And where are they in development? So when you see behavior, behavior is communication. We all know that. So behavior being communication of where they are developmentally when they hit their maximum capacity to cope, when their cognition has reached its max and they are fatiguing, right? So instead of saying they're super lazy, they look super tired sometimes, but they look like they're not trying. They really are cognitively struggling to keep up and to give us the outcomes that we are asking for. And so when we look at that, we can see these kiddos really are working extra hard instead of not working enough. And that's what we're seeing with this base function not operating with those birth to 3 skills that we expect all students to come with. They're not producing. And a really good example of that is kindergarten. And any kindergarten first grade teacher out there, especially now since COVID, we know that COVID has changed everything about, you know, our social emotional development and how kids have progressed as quickly as they could have if they had been in class. And average gap in development for kids is about 3 years entering kindergarten. So when we see that 5-year-old that's hiding under the table, that's hissing at the teacher, that is running out of the room or running around the room, all of those behaviors are very toddler-like. And so when we look at development, 3-year gaps, we're basically dealing with a 2-year-old in a kindergarten classroom. And we know that they can't produce what we're asking them to with attention system to sit down and be quiet, join circle time, transition well from things that they want to do to things that are non-preferred. So we're seeing a lot of that function impact their development and creating those gaps that then impact their maturity and their behavior, which is of course their communication.
So Roxanne, can I stop you for a minute? So when you say start them with their function, what my mind went to, so clarifying question is, so that let's use that example. We've got and I've experienced that as a principal, right? A small friend who's running around the room because in kindergarten, this gap can be that they're acting like a toddler, and you say start with function. Is that a teacher trying to, through that lens of understanding, okay, develop function wise, this is where they might be. And I know a big thing learning is starting with their strengths. I mean, I know you're going to get into some strategies, but I guess I'm just wondering what does that look like, sound like, right? To start at a kiddo's function.
Yeah. So the lens is just how we view them, how we approach them. We come into a classroom being taught a ton of strategies for behavior modification. Behavior modification is giving an outcome with a consequence, right? We want an action with a consequence, and then an outcome will happen. Obviously, if you do this, then this will happen, and then we know how to behave after that. We are teaching A plus B equals C. So we don't jump on the furniture at home. We don't jump on the furniture at school or at grandma's house. That rule is if you jump on the furniture, you'll get in trouble, and we don't want to experience trouble, right? So when we're trying to think through behavior modifications, those things are wonderful for kids who have the function to apply those skills. when we see that those kids cannot apply basic behavior modifications, we know function's not there. We assume they're being defiant, or we assume that they are being naughty, right?
It's really because their brain is not ready to do that.
Right. And so that is this first step, is that lens to view through. And then when we start applying correction strategies to behavior based on development and function, then we can see the outcomes change, because we will look at a second grader and say, well, 8-year-olds should be able to do this. And so we're going to keep hitting them with strategies and behavior, modifications to change behavior, when we need to go back and address function and development. So what that might look like is whenever a child is a 2-year-old in a kindergarten classroom and we see them running around, that developmental age is what I have to think through when I am addressing that child individually. By and large, 50-60% of your kids are going to be able to be corrected with those behavior strategies. They will be able to recover, move on, bounce back very quickly, and keep going. But what we know about these kids, they have to be addressed based on development. So the 2-year-old in the kindergarten classroom looks like redirection strategies, distraction strategies like we would for a 2-year-old. It's very hard for us to view that little boy or little girl who's their big 5-year-old body and treat them as if they're a 2-year-old, because we are saying in our own minds, you're old enough, you should be able to do this, right? And we do that subconsciously. It's not that we don't, get where they're coming from, but we kind of tend to generalize and try to get the group back on track. One of the things that we talk a lot about is obviously the goal is to keep the child in the classroom. And so often when we have kids that behave in a way that is disruptive to the group, we end up removing that child. And our goal is to recognize function and development early enough in their behavior, basically patterns, because they do have patterns. They're consistently inconsistent in their patterns, but we notice that they do have patterns. So every child has their cues that they're going to give off to tell us that they are reaching that maximum capacity to cope, right? For some kids, the fuse is very short. For others, it's very long. And so we have to address each child individually so that when we are meeting them where they are, we are helping them to regulate. And we talk all the time about the differences between teaching children to self-regulate, which again, in our lens, we look at that child and say, they are old enough to self-regulate. They just need to learn the strategies to self-regulate. But what we found with that lack of development and function is they are still in that state of needing co-regulation. And I always joke and say it's like Lamaze. If you've ever had a baby or gone through labor with your wife, when you say, honey, it's time to breathe, she wants to punch you. But when the nurse comes over and starts to breathe in front of you, your mirroring neurons take over and you all of a sudden start to breathe just like she's breathing. And telling someone to regulate versus showing them how to regulate and helping them mirror how to regulate is the huge difference in the approach we've always taken with kids, because we're teachers and we teach strategy and we expect them to learn strategy and then apply strategy. But what we're seeing with these students is that their fight or flight system is engaged all the time, and they need co-regulators to come alongside them to help them remain in the environment, to feel safe. And we go back to connection before correction. That child has to feel connected to you, has to feel safe in order to receive information. And the things that we do based on whether you're following the BIST program or another program where your ultimate goal is to help them process and apply and then get back to their environment. These kids don't process. They will tell you 5 minutes after, I don't know why I just did what I did. And they're really accurate. They don't know why, because that brain is firing in different places for them than it is for us. And so going to that space of where are they in development, where are they in function, and how can I meet them and regulate with them? And every student is different. Like I said, you're going to identify what their triggers are to be able to view them through their own lens of where they're functioning, so that then we can apply the strategies that work with them.
So Roxanne, as I'm hearing you talk, I think one of the biggest barriers, just speaking for myself as a teacher, would be having the knowledge base to identify, especially as before I had kids, right? It's different now that I've had toddlers, so I can kind of, if I was looking at it through that lens, help identify where they might be in their function.
Yeah.
But any tips for teachers as far as when I'm trying to de-emotionalize and depersonalize it, that it may not be on purpose, that we can't really look at a child's body thinking about what's going on in the brain, but how do we help them identify what function level a kiddo might be working
So
on?
we have a really great tool that I will share with you that you can share with everybody. It is a birth to 17 strategy book that basically has developmental standards for where they should be operating. And it does break it down into academic and cognition versus social emotional, because those two regions of the brain are very different. And one can be very developed and even overdeveloped, while another one can be very underdeveloped. And I mentioned it being, they're very consistently inconsistent. We talk about consistency over time is what creates new neural pathways. That's what everybody has always heard their whole life. It takes 21 days to build a habit. It actually takes many more repetitions to build a neural pathway, but the repetition over time is what does that work. But what we see for kids is they can have really advanced areas and really underdeveloped areas. And what we want to do is bring a consistency and raise the bar for everything to be as consistent and as even as possible. And that's why we call it brain balance, because we want kids to be in balance with both the cognition side as well as the social emotional side. But I have that tool that I'll share with you.
Awesome. I think that could be really helpful. And so one of the biggest strategies, just to parrot what I've heard and kind of summarize, is we tend to, and I like how you said as teachers, want to teach something and reinforce, where one of the biggest strategies we can use with kiddos who are struggling is calling it co-regulators, and that we're really mirroring. And I thought you gave such a good visual, the nursing example, that as teachers, one of the biggest strategies, if there is a regulation strategy we want, to be demonstrating it in front of a child, because, and I can't remember the term you used, but it might just click in automatically that this is how I calm down. And also, teachers know this, but want to reiterate just this connection before correction, that relationships really are everything. But having some strategies in your back pocket. And to me, the biggest takeaway here is, and I know teachers are learning this through trauma-informed schools as well, but that lens of, they've been looking at it through the lens of trauma, where sometimes it might be just be the lens of, where is your brain at? Don't look at your body. Where might your brain be functioning? And that it's so hard as a teacher not to take it personal.
I know. And it's so great that the trauma-informed care has been a big focus these last several years, because we do know that there are lots of kids experiencing trauma. But what we found in this research and in this development piece, these kids come from a really great home. They've never had a single major traumatic experience in their life. Now, we all have what they call ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, whether it's a move or a divorce or something where it's just a major change in normal function or scheduling or how you're living your life. And those are things that will impact your brain in development as well. But what we're finding is whenever kids operate with this low function, their brains have that fight or flight turned on, and it's as if they have experienced trauma. And so for them to operate in fight or flight all the time, I liken it to a person who has PTSD. We understand that if someone comes back from war and they have PTSD, they're on that verge or that edge of that emotional response to blow up and get angry or to shut down and have negative thoughts. But we don't understand that kids are operating in that same system, and it doesn't look the same for them. It doesn't even look the same for every child. But what we do know is that they have to feel safe and feel protected, because those emotions are so big, they don't have the skills to put them in place and logically walk through them. And so that's where that co-regulation comes in. But it has to be based in that connection and that feeling safe, and that it's okay to have those big emotions. And what we end up communicating to kids is, it's not okay. We can't help you. You're going to go to a different room, or a different adult has to come in and take care of you, because I'm not the one who can do it for you. And then there's a break of trust in that teacher-child relationship. And so then we start to see those boundaries getting pushed more and more often, and those explosive behaviors happening. And then they are creatures of habit. And so if they know that that person outside the classroom is the one that can help them with big emotions, they're going to get to that person, right?
Right.
So going back to that feeling of safety and connection and co-regulation, not only with the mirroring pieces, but some of the strategies that we'll share a little bit further down in the series too. It's just so important to start with that lens and to try and reframe our thinking as adults in the room of how we can be that co-regulator in that space. And it doesn't just happen in kindergarten. It happens in high school. It happens in middle school. You know, we have so many kids in so many different spaces and places, but you really can learn that art of seeing where they are and catching it before they get into full-blown fight or flight. And it's really rewarding when we can get to that point and watch them recover and rebound very quickly.
Awesome. So before we wrap up this call, and I thank you for all the great nuggets, can you summarize for the audience just things that you could be offering to help? Because I know, again, you brought up COVID, and I think we've seen just a huge spike because developmentally kids haven't been able to get some of the experiences to move their development. What are some things that Brain Balance can offer schools that they may not be aware of?
Yeah, so Brain Balance job is to build function. So when we see kids that come into the classroom without function, that's what our program does. It goes back and it builds that foundation of function, and then it also builds development in those regions that are underdeveloped. So that's our job here. That's what we do individually with students. We also do that with adults. Our program has actually expanded from 4 to 94. But what we can offer for classrooms and buildings that want to bring us in is that education on the latest brain research about, you know, how do kids truly develop? What are the things that are impacting them? The last 40-year study showed there is a 10-year average gap for students who struggle by the time they're 40. And that study is extremely old, right? So when we track a group of people for 40 years and we see outcomes, it hasn't even touched on the developmental problems that we're seeing in the last 20 years, but even in the last 2 years that have impacted not only kids, but adults. We see adults struggling with focus and attention, their maximum capacity to cope with frustration and intolerance. So we can come in with that education. We do free professional development for certain amounts of time. And then if you want longer amounts of time, we do charge a small fee for that. But what we do is we want to educate people. We want teachers to have the tools, because more and more students are coming in struggling. I taught in the classroom 20 years ago, and I had 3 students out of 25 that were struggling and that I had to, make sure that I was monitoring and keeping tabs on. But now we know that there are up to 50% of students in a classroom that struggle. So these are not just one-off students anymore that need extra help outside of school. These are the majority of our kids. And COVID created that number that is just increased.
Awesome. So to follow up, I will post this video and I'll put your email on there with that tool sheet. So if schools are interested, I mean, that's why I want to do on the call. I think that's just amazing that you offer some free resources. Just we're not prepared for it in college. Yeah. And so I just thank you for your time. Quickly, we have a few people on the call. Are there any questions that anyone on the call has before we stop recording here?
I don't think so. Not for me.
Okay. Well, if not, then I want to thank everybody for their time today. I hope that it was useful. I definitely learned a lot. So thank you so much, Roxanne. And we will put your follow-up information with this video.
Sounds great. And I look forward to the next one to share some more strategies.
Awesome.